Early access and survival are two things a lot of people don't want to hear in the same sentence. It's become one of the most oversaturated matching of games on the Steam store over the past few years, with most games tending to be mediocre or just plain bad. The game I'm going to look at today is one which in my opinion breaks this norm. A game with polish, and most importantly, brimming with potential. This is The Wild 8. The Wild 8 is an early access survival game by 8 Points. It started as a Kickstarter project before being released on the Steam store on the 8th of February 2017. As of April 2017, it has not yet been released on consoles, but it was originally planned to be released on the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 as Kickstarter stretch goals. I picked up this game on the 28th of March and played it for roughly 10 hours before the Beyond the Door update was released on April 7th, and have since played a further 10 hours since then. 3 small patches have been released in the 6 days following, which is a pretty good show of commitment from the developers, though there are no notes on what actually changed, so they're likely just very minor bug fixes. In this video I hope to provide a solid analysis of the game in its current state, whilst offering criticism and some suggestions for improvement in the game. The gameplay in the background will be a mix of relevant gameplay with a let's play type filler of me just playing the single player mode. There will be spoilers in this video, so you have been warned. Before starting, I do wish to make this clear, this is not a review. The game is in an early access state, and it may not be a good representation of what the game is like in future. Although I do like to play games on the basis that if I have to pay for it, early access or not, it should be open to criticism. In the interest of clarity, if I make any mistakes or if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I will do my best to answer or correct myself for future viewing. The game is advertised as an eerie co-op survival game with a mysterious storyline in a procedurally generated world. This is important as it shows the game is intended to be played with multiple people, but it is possible to play on your own. There is a main storyline and many different side quest type scenarios randomly scattered around the map that add a bit of world building as well as providing rewards for the player that actually take their time to explore the rest of the game. The first thing you will notice when you start the game is most likely the aesthetic, which is obviously subjective, but I like the use of lighting and the overall look of the game. I'm always a sucker for snow in games, which for me was part of the draw. I was looking specifically for a survival game with multiplayer access, and the snowy wilderness of Alaska really made The Wild 8 stand out for me. The other thing that might strike you is the soundtrack. I compare the music as being similar to that of Minecraft, at least when I played it in the alpha. That might seem like a strange thing to say. The soundtrack changes depending on your scenario, which is what I mean by it. At its core, there's a peaceful tune that plays as you explore, and it's interrupted or changed when you encounter aggressive enemies and new places. But it's the basic, calm tune that just has you losing track of time with general exploration and character upkeep. Here, I'll put a few on just to listen to for a few seconds. The settings are nothing too fancy, but they're entirely functional. There isn't much to choose from other than a few presets when it comes to graphical options. You have the option to switch between windowed and full screen, change resolution, apply VSync to your monitor, and you can also toggle ambient occlusion and anti-aliasing. I haven't really had any issues on my computer at least, so that's good enough for me. There are sliders for sound, general sounds and music, which is sufficient enough, but a split for sound effects and environmental effects like weather would be preferable for me personally. Interestingly enough, you also have many different languages to choose from. There are no fully voiced characters that I'm aware of in the game, so as all the dialogue is shown in text, this is easier to implement. You can choose between English, French, German, Portuguese, simplified Chinese, Korean, Russian, Japanese, Mexican Spanish, and Polish. I have no need for any of these, but I think it's admirable of them to actually provide the option for other languages where other games don't, and it might be the difference between someone actually buying the game and not buying the game. You also have the choice between a number of different control presets, as well as being able to rebind most functions too. Again, whilst this doesn't really matter too much to me, I know that for some people who are left-handed or have certain disabilities, this is crucial for them being able to actually enjoy a game. With the boring bit about settings out of the way, let's move on to the actual fun stuff. The actual game. The player is allowed to select one of 8 characters, each with their own skill that sets them apart from the others. The game sets the player in the wilderness of Alaska, where the player wakes up stranded after a plane crash, surrounded by a few pieces of food and a medkit. By default, you can use WASD to move around and left-click to interact with your surroundings and pick up items. A skippable tutorial will start which teaches you the basics of movement and how to set up your first shelter and workshop. The game also instructs you on how to build an axe for collecting wood and a campfire for keeping warm. In doing so, the game shows the player that you craft items through the workshop, and so it's well worth your interest in browsing through to see what's there. After creating a torch on the campfire or skipping the tutorial, the main quest starts alongside my first big problem with the game. All the clips in this video are taken from Classic mode, which is supposed to be the developer's intended way of playing the game. Compared to casual mode, you take more damage from enemies and you grow hungry and colder faster. You also lose all of your character's progress when you die, putting your structures back to level 1 and removing all of your skills that you have earned thus far. Here I completed the tutorial, and after capping out my warmth meter by the campfire, I immediately went to where the main quest was trying to send me. After finding another portion of the wrecked plane, you find a generator you need to place inside the nearby radio tower. But there is a set wolf placement just outside that you cannot fight this early on, even with the medkit. The game doesn't teach you about weapons or armor, or the throwable rocks that allow you to stun. My first playthrough of this game was on easy mode and on multiplayer, where fighting the wolf was incredibly easy. But I don't think it's unreasonable to think that someone might die here on their first try at no real fault of their own, just following the tracks that are set out for them by the developers. This isn't exactly true though. The game does instruct you to build a torch, which most might think is used as a light source, but it's not just that. Striking a wolf with the torch will cause it to flee. All the pieces are there, but for me it wasn't until actually making this video that it even clicked for me that this might even happen. I put it down to maybe poor thought process on the developer side, when it was in fact my inability to think creatively. Though this wasn't just me, the 2 other people that I played with didn't realise this either, and you might think us all idiots, but I think the game could have better communicated the usage considering how you've literally just started playing. You could also see this as the game teaching the player that you have to explore and upgrade before progressing if you're playing alone, or maybe that death is just so easy to come by, but I think they could have chosen a better way of making this clear to the player. They could have made the main quest to simply survive for the first few nights, before changing to entice the player into exploring further out, or better explain the tools that you set up with in the tutorial. They could also simply remove the wolf or tone down its damage to be more in line with the player power at the time. It's only 1, and quite quickly the player should begin learning how to actually deal with different enemies themselves. Once you defeat the wolf, either by killing it or causing it to flee, you can power up the radio tower, revealing a nearby portion of the map and allowing you to see more of your surroundings. I think this is a great addition to the game that even Ubisoft should be envious of. It provides a great way of opening up the map and showing you places of interest without requiring too much from the player. As long as you can find the generator somewhere, you can power it up and you're good to go. This might show its own problem, as generators aren't usually close to the radio towers and inventory management can be quite awkward. But you can reveal the map by simply exploring yourself anyway, so it's not too big an issue. From here, the game really opens up and you'll need to start learning fast, as your starting supplies won't last forever. You can go and do whatever you like from the moment you're dropped into the game, but this is most likely the moment where the player will choose to begin taking their time and learning to survive. You have 3 bars in the corner that you have to monitor as you play: your health, your hunger, and your temperature. If your health becomes empty, you die, dropping all of your equipment and respawning back at the crash site, presumably as a new survivor, but it's a bit strange because your equipment can be found along with your rotting human flesh where you died. But I won't question that too much, as there's supernatural elements to the story, and it could simply just be a gameplay element to cut out loading screens and stuff like that. Your hunger and temperature both deplete over time. Eating food will restore small amounts of health, and depending on the food, will restore small to large amounts of your hunger. Temperature has a few ways of resisting the speed of reduction and can be increased by standing next to a fire of some kind. If either your hunger or temperature are emptied, you are put in a state of near death, which gives you a movement penalty and sees your health rapidly deplete until you die. As you perform any action in the game, you generate experience points in the relevant field. Killing an animal will give you experience with hunting. Striking an enemy will increase your offensive experience. Chopping down trees and beating on rocks will give you gathering experience. Even just moving around will give you something towards upgrading your character in your tent. The skill tree is tiered by levels that require you to upgrade your shelter using simple and then later rare materials. The shelter also provides you with resistance from the cold, and a bag slot per level of upgrade. You can also choose to sleep here, which has you wait for 2 minutes, requiring some wood and ore, but it will restore your hunger and your temperature if you sleep for the full duration. This was likely implemented for players who struggled to hit the ground running, and while I have never actually had to use it, I think it's a good idea. If the days were a bit longer, I wouldn't mind the nights being a bit more punishing to encourage players to actually have to make the decision of whether they sleep or carry on as normal. They could also implement some kind of rest meter that prevents you from just going days on end without actually sleeping. But as you literally can't do anything except choose to wake up early and lose the benefits, some menu reworking would be nice. Or maybe they could just make it so that at least on easy mode, you'll respawn where you last slept in your tent to reduce the tediousness of finding your equipment again, and if anything, to give the sleep function more of a purpose. The most useful part of the shelter is that it allows you to allocate skill points as you gain experience. The workshop is the other major structure you are instructed to build in the tutorial. I see it as being the more important of the two, and the first to be upgraded when you have a choice between upgrading the workshop or the shelter. It also requires less valuable resources than the shelter to improve. The workshop is where you create all of your own equipment, from gathering tools to traps and armor. I feel like the items you can create are tiered fairly well in relation to each other, however you end up throwing lesser versions of items on the ground or waiting to fully use them up when you upgrade, as the lesser item isn't used up. I would like to see more thought out repair and upgrade systems put in place to stop you from just creating 10 pairs of wooden shoes over a few hours, and then when you get a pair of leather ones you just throw all the old ones away as there's no way of deleting or salvaging them. The workshop also provides resistance to the elements whilst residing inside it, and the items you create tend to start at stone and move from bone to leather and then finally into iron. Bone and leather is gathered through hunting after gaining the appropriate skills. Iron is created at a forge by adding 60 ore in the same way that you would add food to a fire. The forge is like an upgraded campfire as it cooks food much faster and allows you to create iron, the current highest upgrade material in the game. Both these structures can be picked up and reconstructed free of cost, which encourages you to keep moving as you make your way to your objectives or simply explore the world. You can construct them again whenever you feel like, as long as you have a spare few seconds, which is great when a blizzard comes in and you have the chance to prevent yourself from freezing to death. There is an item you can get that helps you out in the cold, but its uses are limited: animal fat. It increases a player's resistance to the cold and requires a skill in hunting before it will begin being dropped by animals. But it has so few uses that I tend to always just throw it away for an extra bag space, or keep one to make an upgraded torch and only get more when I need to make another one. You can also make adrenaline using animal fat, which increases the player's move speed for a short period of time, but between inventory space being tight early on and it just not really being that useful later on, it ends up being just another item that I never craft, and to be honest, it's always the last hunting skill I end up taking. So far, the first part of the story is done. I knew the game wasn't finished when I got it, but I was still somewhat disappointed when I hit the end of the tracks, more out of anticipation than anything else. After following a bunch of radio towers and power lines, you go to the eastern side of the map to find a bridge, presumably leading to refuge. After already encountering a werewolf-type beast in a bunker, you are now faced with some kind of crazed humanoid. My open-world instinct assumes zombies, but without knowing what's going on, it's hard to tell if they're reanimated corpses, infected, or just insane. Either way, the end of part 1 is where a lot of the paranormal is just crammed in. On the bridge, as you go to cross, you see a purple mist followed by someone telling you to go back, it's not safe. Then what I can only describe as being Nocturne from League of Legends appears right in front of you and chases you all the way back down the bridge from where you came from. And that just ends the story so far. You're simply left wondering what's next. Personally, I'd like to see some way of blending the exploration and questing together a bit more smoothly. At the moment it feels like you're doing one or the other, and it's kind of awkward. For some people that might be fine, but when they want to just go explore, they can, and they can put the main quest in the back of their mind and go look for something new. I would like to see some kind of discovery skill tree that allows you to learn something new, even just equipment recipes or something like that for going to the side quest locations and completing them. Most of the side quests seem to take place in bunkers and warehouses, and are shown by coloured exclamation points on the map when found or revealed by radio towers. This would incentivize players more towards exploration than just going straight for the main quest completion, and it adds another few things onto the 100% completion to-do list, as it were. The real difficulty in a game like this is where you draw the line between realism and fantasy. I stepped into this with the expectation of just a simple survival game and was confused at what to think when I encountered the possible zombie apocalypse. Like, did we really need another one? Come on, really? Maybe it's my affection towards the game at this time, but the stigmas of most survival games really push me away from them with how generic and similar they are. The Wild 8 was different for me because it subverted my expectations after I thought about it. I went from confusion to annoyance to acceptance and finally enjoyment. Now I'm excited to see where the story is going to go and how the plot will unravel, as there's not too much to go on so far. They could really take it in a few different directions. There are a few things that break this realistic scenario that they're going for, like the presence of skill trees and the ability to make a sword from this little building that I built just a few seconds into actually crashing from a plane. As these aren't really story related, it's just an issue of game design more than anything else and is difficult to critique. Yes, they break the realism of the game, but at the same time, if you didn't, would the game actually be fun? Probably not. Exploration is quite possibly the biggest pull of the game. Survival can become quite tedious, so being able to freely run around the world to see what you can find is quite refreshing, and personally I think it's quite a natural part of character progression. Early on in the game you want to venture out to hunt animals for food and materials, and so you'll most likely get sidetracked anyway. As you look at the map to get your bearings, you might notice the exclamation points marking places of interest. They appear when you reveal a tile, and even if you don't, at some point you will look at the map and think, what's that? Normally I see the presence of these place of interest markers as putting the player on rails and becomes more like a game of connect the dots that stops the player from actually paying attention to their surroundings. But this isn't a game like The Witcher 3 or Far Cry. The isometric camera means you can't visibly see the world and what's in it, so I think it's fine in this game. The warehouses, bunkers, and other random places of interest are revealed when you get close enough, and they usually include leftover food or some kind of equipment. Most of the time the equipment is very good, but usually the food is fairly useless as you probably already have a decent stock by then. Some of these places have some kind of story behind them, which is revealed in logs that are scattered around in notebooks or computers, and they explain what's happening, giving you a bit of lore information and maybe explain why the place is actually abandoned. Sometimes you have to restart the generators to light up the place again to get power, and are incentivized to use a torch to see your way through, as they may or may not have enemies in them. I don't know if it's the enemies or the warehouses themselves, but I have had an enemy run through the walls out of bounds and not be able to get back in, and that's an issue that I've encountered. They just sit on the outside of the walls making noise, and they just scare the crap out of me. I wish there was more to find in these places of interest, or more variety at least. Like at one point I encountered a stranded boat partially covered in snow. It didn't have much in it, which is fine, but it had this cool harpoon that would have been fun if I could make them myself from different materials. I've also found a machete type weapon, and it'd be nice if you could learn how to deconstruct these and maybe make your own. It would add some more variety to the crafting. They could also involve some information of where other bunkers are to leave you a sense that the world is connected, or at least at some point it was some kind of networked world. As the game is randomly generated, it would be a nice way of pointing you in a new direction that isn't the main quest. The map itself is seemingly very large, but you are constricted within what's called the Wasteland. I guess it's because the game uses an isometric view, you can't see the outskirts of where your character should be able to go, so to prevent the player from walking off the map there are varying degrees of Wasteland. Wasteland is a debuff that appears on screen that will prevent you from gaining any warmth. likely putting you quickly into the near-death state. From the description, it makes it sound like there's nothing there. It would be cool if at some point in the story or in your character progression you can craft strong enough items that allow you to endure the wasteland and explore extra content, but that would mean implementing content to be explored, contradicting this go no further point that the wasteland represents. I like that it's not just a fence keeping the player out. You can try and should hopefully realise quite quickly that you're out of your depth. But it would really suck if you had to lose a character here just by trying to satiate your curiosity and have all of your progression reset. To me, the most annoying part of the exploration is the weather. Oddly enough, the snowy colds of Alaska is part of what actually pulled me into this game, but it's the blizzards that really piss me off. I like the idea of blizzards being in the game, but I think their implementation is poor. A blizzard is represented through a status icon in the corner, as well as a whiteout effect on the screen. They quickly extinguish campfires and they cause your character to start freezing. There is seemingly no way to tell that a blizzard is coming. They last random amounts of times, and sometimes I've gone days without encountering one, and other times I've had blizzard after blizzard, 3 times in a row with less than 10 seconds in between one ending and the next one starting. It doesn't seem fair that a blizzard can end and start up straight away again. The player has no time to recover from the cold that they have to endure. Eating is very fast, so that's not as much of an issue. You can just be sat waiting for quite some time before you can do anything. But I don't know why the blizzards even stop if they're just going to begin right away again. It's more frustrating than anything else when you think, finally I can carry on, and are just forced back into your tent straight away. I would like to see varying levels of blizzards that have different degrees of harshness, but are communicated to the player through sound cues, or maybe you could use the radio towers and have the player find an item at the first one in the main quest that allows you to receive weather warnings if you're within range of a powered up radio tower. The different levels of blizzard could range from lowest, just reducing your player's vision, to the highest, causing permanent damage over time to the player's equipment, or even light damage to the player themselves. Maybe they could do structural damage to your shelter and workshop if they aren't packed away and you have to repair them again to get full use. This provides a greater challenge to more geared up players that can just tank the temperature drop for long periods of time, and it doesn't screw the players that are just starting off. It could also be another way of increasing your character's defense skill, which is the most awkward skill to increase, as you don't really want to take damage, but you benefit from doing so in a non-life-threatening way. The forge has a weird interaction with blizzards too, as the wind doesn't extinguish the fires in the forge. It makes sense, it's an enclosed flame, but it allows the player to just stand by it even at the game's coldest and you'll gain warmth. Stood in the centre of a blizzard, you get warm. I understand in your highest upgraded shelter you can find some solace, but I can't understand standing a few feet away from a forge. It just doesn't make sense. The combat in this game is okay. It's not amazing, but it's not bad either. In the gameplay trailer, it explains that each animal has a different behaviour and may require a different technique to kill effectively. Personally, I found the most effective way to kill an animal is to just run circles around it, throwing rocks at it every few seconds to stun it, before getting a hit in and running away. I like to think of myself as the Muhammad Ali of the Alaskan surviving world, but quite a few bears would probably disagree with me, whilst laughing at me. I feel like it's important to note that no matter what kind of weapon you end up going for, and whether it's ranged or melee, the throwable rocks are so strong that they are necessary for actually hunting effectively. The rocks are very easy to make, they do a small amount of damage and will likely stun the target that you hit for a moment, allowing you to safely deal damage. The boars and the bears seem to have some kind of stun resistance, lowering their chance of getting stunned, and all enemies gain resistance after being struck by a rock to prevent them from just being continuously stun-locked for an easy kill. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there are a lot of useless items. It might look like there are a few tiers of armour, but with resources being scarce, there's little reason to not just keep using wooden armour and wooden shoes until you have enough for the highest level ones. You can build traps that will ensnare enemies, and better traps, causing increasing amounts of damage and bleeding on the target. But players can trigger traps themselves, making them dangerous to the user, and whilst they are somewhat cumbersome to use, they are mostly ineffective anyway. You have to awkwardly kite enemies on top of them and are totally useless when it comes to hunting rabbits. The developers are aware of this bug for the time being. Rabbits are seemingly the easiest of the most basic animals to hunt, but at the same time they're the most difficult without a bow because the traps don't work. I'm not really quite sure how to improve the implementation of traps. Some of the players have been vocal in saying that they're quite strong, but personally I never liked them, so I don't use them. If you could lure animals in by placing food on them, I think that would be a nice change. Then you not only have to be careful about placement, but you also have to make the decision of whether or not placing food on top of it for a higher chance of success is worth it. It might take you a few seconds to do so, like erecting a structure so that you can't just cheese it and just throw one on there in the middle of combat. After a quick go at fighting a few different animals, it'll probably show the player that fighting more than one at the same time is very dangerous on your own, and you should take caution when you're exploring. If you play with a few friends, however, not many of the enemies are actually dangerous. In fact, you're more dangerous to each other than you are the animals you're supposed to be hunting. If you have poor coordination, you might hit each other or run into more enemies. This mixed with higher level weapons gaining a chance to stun or cause bleeding. If 8 of you tried to fight one enemy, it would probably not go very well at all. Once you craft a bow, you can make 2 types of ammunition, which simply just do different levels of damage. I'm glad you can't be cliche and light your arrows on the fire to carry around with you for hours until you need to pull them out and magically they're still on fire and you're completely unharmed. But maybe there are players out there that are just begging for fire arrows and I'm just not one of them. Enemy variation isn't too bad. You have regular enemies, enhanced enemies that are just stronger versions of the regular ones, and then supernatural enemies. Regular enemies are rabbits, deers, boars, wolves, and bears, in that kind of order as the threat that they are to the player. Wolves and bears have enhanced versions, with the wolves having glowing eyes and being slightly larger. The player often says, "That wolf looks scary," when encountering them for the first time, to indicate that they're slightly different. For bears, they look like polar bears, and from my experience are only in a scripted area towards the end of the first part of the main quest. I like the idea of having enhanced enemies, but they don't really offer much more of a challenge. They just have more health and hit harder, but other than that, they're just identical. The wolves still have a chance to cause bleeding, and the bears can still stun you. But if you aren't taking any damage, then they're effectively the same. I don't know how possible it would be, but I think it would be more interesting if they reduce the amount of enhanced enemies that you encounter, but make them more challenging for the player. Wolves could howl and attract other nearby regular wolves. This would incentivize using a torch to fight them as you struggle for space. The bears could make the traps more useful if you're able to track them and prepare yourself for a fight. Maybe if you see a poached animal or a survivor nearby, or maybe large tracks, it would indicate that there's a tough enemy nearby, and it would encourage you to plan. Supernatural enemies usually have more health and do a lot more damage. There's a werewolf-like beast that you can encounter, zombies or reanimated corpses or whatever they're supposed to be. Nocturne from League of Legends also has a scripted appearance, and hopefully he's some kind of late-game boss or enemy. That really is just the best way I can describe him for anyone who's played League of Legends. There's just a similarity that I can't not see. The zombie-type enemy is just a tough but basic enemy. They run at you and can stun you, and that's about it. The werewolf, however, will relentlessly chase you and does large amounts of damage. I like the idea of there being a boss or difficult encounters, but the implementation just isn't too good here. The hitbox of the attacks seem very unfair. I could understand if I was playing online and it was lag, but this was just single player with no latency. I would still get hit from attacks that clearly weren't colliding with my player model. I would also like to see such a rare enemy have some kind of enrage mechanic or a more complex telegraphed attacks that are fairly communicated to the player whilst still allowing for a challenging fight. One thing I do like is that you can swing anything that you can equip in your hand for damage, and even throwing random items at something will do something. So if your weapon breaks when fighting a bear and he's almost dead, go ahead and throw 100 logs at it until it dies. It's also quite humorous when sharing items with other survivors in multiplayer. Throwing food or bandages their way may damage them if they're struck directly with it. It's annoying when it happens to you, but I find it hilarious to think that someone out there was on the brink of death in the wilderness and they ended up meeting their demise when struck with a healing salve that would have saved them. There is seemingly no trading system. You have to drop everything that you want to trade. It would be nice if you could simply hand it over to the person by just dragging the item and dropping it over their character like you would something onto a campfire. Maybe an improvement for the future. As long as I can still level cooked meat at someone's face and hurt them, I don't really mind. For healing, there are a few different ways. Eating food will recover some health over the duration of consumption. If your character is full and you try to recover health with food, you will become bloated from overeating and you'll become slowed. This is good as it stops you from abusing food to heal and makes it potentially more dangerous to eat during combat. Healing cells, bandages, and medkits can restore health instantly, well, almost instantly. It recovers it over around a quarter of a second, so it might as well be. Healing salves and bandages are crafted and restore around 1/5 to 1/6 of your health. If they're created by Anna, they restore twice as much health but are separate in-game items, so they have to take up a separate inventory space and they won't stack with the normal ones. Bandages stop bleeding, but are a bit more difficult to make. They require scraps of leather, which, obvious as it sounds, comes from destroying leather, but it's already a valuable item. Medkits are a very large heal, but they can't be created by the player, they're just found around the world, and are appropriately scarce. I have mentioned the skills a few times, so I should probably go over who you are as the character that you've chosen and showcase the different skills that you can take. All of the 8 characters have the same skill set, but have their own passive perk that sets them out from each other. Only one of each character can be selected in multiplayer. Anna doubles the effect of all medical supplies that she crafts. Robin has a 5% increase to his movement speed, attack speed, ranged attack power, and a 10% increase to his stamina recovery speed. Cole has 10% more melee attack power and a 5% increase to stamina recovery speed. William has 10% extra defense and 5% extra resistance to the cold. Chang gains you skill points 10% faster. Vivian has a 5% higher crit chance, which is 10% from behind, and she gathers 40% more wood and ore. Jeffrey creates items that have 25% more durability, and finally Oliver requires 10% less materials to upgrade structures and create items. It's nice that there are multiple different characters to choose from, but for me there aren't 8. There's 3 or 4. At a push there's 6. Chang and Oliver have such poor passives that they just aren't really worth taking, and they also don't really offer anything to the group in a multiplayer setting either. Learning skills only slightly faster is so minor it just isn't worth it. Especially when ideally you don't want to die, you don't want your skills to reset. Late game you would eventually have all the skills anyway, and then you have a dead passive that gives you literally no bonuses. What they could do instead is have him give everyone a percentage-based bonus, or make it so that he gains experience as everyone else does, so that he learns from the experience of others. The same thing is true about Oliver. The percentage bonus is so low for a benefit that doesn't affect anyone else. The reduced percentage to build cost isn't enough for you to just not pick Jeffrey, then the equipment lasts longer, which is more useful than requiring less. I feel like the best characters are Jeffrey, Anna, and Vivian. They serve the group, big or small, with useful benefits for single player. There is a case for Robin and Cole being useful as well. Really, you could just pick any character and still do well, which I do like, but it would be nice to see the weaker characters get looked at once more to bring them more in line with each other. I should note that as well as there being different characters to choose from, there's a currently unused personalization option in the menu. There are no notes about this, and you can't access it yet, so it's seemingly just a placeholder menu for the future. But it would be interesting to see what kind of personalization is provided and whether or not you unlock them through gameplay or whether it will be implemented as the dreaded chest and key system like so many other games have chosen to go for. I really hope they don't go down that route. It could really incentivize playing lots of characters and taking on different playstyles if there was some kind of challenge system in the game to unlock cosmetics. Kill 50 deer using a bow with character X or something along those lines. They could also change the starting scenario and have you start with certain equipment in different areas once you pass these challenges that would really spice up the gameplay for recurrent playthroughs. All characters gain the same skills as you play. You earn experience from fighting, taking damage, moving around, and gathering resources. The experience points you earn are independent from each other. For example, a skill point gained from gathering cannot be used to upgrade your mobility. This means that you're probably going to upgrade your gathering quite quickly to start off, then it slows down and you'll swing more towards gaining combat-related skills for the rest of your playthrough, and mobility will be somewhere in between. There was some skill rebalancing that went on with the Beyond the Door update, which has also added a 6th tier of upgrades. Hunting skills give you additional drops from killing animals and is required to start collecting bones, tendons, leather, and animal fat. Mobility skills mainly focus on just that, it's what it sounds like. The ability to sprint and passive upgrades to your movement speed and shoe degradation. Offense skills give you higher base damage, attack speed, and increase the frequency and effectiveness of your critical strikes. Defense has you resist damage and different status effects and help you survive in combat. And finally, gathering helps you with inventory space and material gathering and management. I think the overhaul was a good change. Some of the skills they put in are nice, whilst others leave a lot to be desired. My first gripe with the skill system is a really small one, but it still annoys me. Why don't you start with the ability to sprint? Maybe your character is still recovering from the plane crash or getting their bearings with the snow. It's even the first mobility skill that you gain, and you get it so fast that it just seems very strange to me. I find it completely ridiculous that such an important movement mechanic is missing from the get-go. Some people might think I'm just exaggerating or being petty, but to me it feels like it was implemented as a skill because they couldn't figure out anything else to put in, or they experimented with it early on and just didn't take it out again. I'd rather have a short dodge, dive, or roll that costs a huge amount of stamina and can even get you stuck in the snow for a moment whilst you struggle to free yourself again or find your feet. That would be a risky way of evading larger enemies, and maybe it's not as punishing if you're fighting enemies in groups together. Defense is also a poorly gained stat. I get the idea that maybe it acts as a crutch for players that take a lot of hits, but I disagree that it should effectively punish players who are good at the combat and rarely take hits, and thus don't earn any experience. By not taking any skills in defense, it might mean a player gets quickly stunned and killed because they took one hit from a bad hitbox on a beast and didn't have any stun resistance. I get that you have to earn the experience somewhere, and you can't funnel everything through combat and make you earn lots from just killing things. I also don't think it's fair to just straight up kick the crutches out from newer players' feet, but there is some compromise to be made here. I think you should earn a little bit of experience from killing enemies and then maybe balance it out by having blizzards cause light damage to the player or degrading armor whilst giving points in defense at the same time. The skills for hunting are well paced to start off with, but the latter few are just more of this item, when you already have that earlier on. More for the sake of variety than anything else, I would like to see it changed, even to something like percentage-based damage increases on particular animals. You start off with getting bones and then tendons, leather, and then finally animal fat. I don't like that the bones become irrelevant so quickly once you get the leather to upgrade your workshop and build iron items. This also ties into my criticism of the items not having any way of being repaired or upgraded themselves, in that you further get into the game and more items become less used and simply never used again. By the time you have gained that many levels of upgrade for your shelter and that much experience in hunting, you really don't need the bones that the increased drop rate in the second last tier would give you. The same happens with the tendon drop rate upgrade in the final tier. Though tendons remain more useful than bones, you just don't need as many of them the further you go in, as the better items have a higher durability anyway. Instead of these last two skills, it would be nice to have some kind of tracking ability with different levels allowing you to track different animals. This could allow you to see footprints in the snow or other tells that signal that a certain animal is nearby, and maybe have the blizzards reset these tracks as the snow is blown around. Prints are already created by players and animals and simply fade over a small amount of time, so they would just have to change how they work. Death takes many forms in the Wild 8, depending on the difficulty that you play on. On both classic and easy difficulties, when you die, you're sent back to the plane crash site where you started. You drop all of your items where you died, along with a piece of human flesh. When this happens, your days survived counter is reset, but the state of the game doesn't. For example, if you played with another person and you got to day 21, and it's the middle of the night, the middle of a blizzard, when you respawn, you have nothing to fend off the elements, and you might just end up dying again straight away because the blizzard is still going and it's still nighttime. It sucks, but I don't really have much of an issue with this. Your items you previously dropped don't disappear should you die a second time, and I don't really think there's any way to change it without breaking the immersion or having some way of it not affecting the other players. The other option is to provide players with more options when death occurs, like broken bones or skill penalties with matching items to heal such injuries. Maybe it's not death, and you're just knocked unconscious for other players to resuscitate you. There's supposed to be a defibrillator in the game that does something like this, but it's said that it's very rare, but I've never even come across it. Maybe it is just that rare or it's not been implemented yet. The difference between the two difficulties are as follows. In classic mode, when you die, the upgrades you have added to your shelter and workshop are lost, along with any skills that you've taken. You're effectively starting over as a new survivor. Difference here being that on easy mode, as well as taking reduced damage from enemies and your hunger and temperature doesn't go down quite as quickly, you also keep your skills and your structure levels when you die. As you still lose your items, you have to make the decision on whether or not you think it's worth going back to them again straight away. You might not remember where they are, and there is no map marker that tells you, oh, you dropped your stuff here. You may have to make the decision of finding more equipment again in order to venture out to gain what you lost. I really think that in easy mode at least, you should be able to change your spawn location, be it through the main storyline or through sleeping in your shelter. I know the game wants you to be constantly moving around instead of having one central location of comfort, but there really isn't anything to stop you from just farming up all of your skills until you hit your comfort level, and placing all of your equipment and materials in chests around the spawn so that just in case you die, you have them to fall back on. I also like the idea that as an extra challenge when you die, you don't simply drop anything. The game already has a supernatural eeriness to it. It would be interesting if you had to fight your reanimated corpse before reclaiming your items. That way, the stronger your character was, the more difficult a challenge it would be, and it would provide a more plausible reason for why so much equipment is just randomly there on the ground. So I mainly play single player in this game because I like the challenge. I'm a lone wolf, I'm independent and responsible, but more importantly because I don't have any friends. The online play is actually very stable, and even playing on the American servers from Europe, I never really noticed any latency in play. The Wild 8 is intended to be played with multiple people, but this raises a few different problems. Firstly, there's no voice chat. There is a text chat, but that isn't very useful if you need to communicate during combat. Something realistically that you would be able to do if you were in their shoes, if you were in the character's shoes. It isn't so bad for experienced players, but might be an issue for newer players when it comes to running groups with strangers. Nowadays, with the likes of TeamSpeak, Discord, Skype, and other free communication programs, it's easy to circumvent this issue if you're in an organised group. But that shouldn't be an excuse not to implement better tools for communication. If they didn't want to add voice chat, some kind of communication wheel that has your character indicate danger, a need for resources, or pointing out direction would be incredibly useful. I haven't tried playing with strangers because I don't want to deal with the frustration of not being able to communicate properly, but I probably would play if this wasn't such an issue. Even though single player and multiplayer are separate from each other, there's seemingly no form of difficulty scaling, which I don't particularly mind from my single player experience. But when it comes to multiplayer, it seems very easy. Most enemies can be easily killed by stunning them once or twice and just overwhelming them with numbers and hits. The game very quickly becomes more about managing the tediums like food upkeep and having enough materials for multiple people. This really shows how great the split is between developer intentions, because with more people you require more items without there actually being any more there. You have more hands to speed up the gathering, but the challenge is organically there. It's just not really that challenging. Dying in this game is more punishing alone than it is in a group. You can easily get given more gear again, which I think is the point based on how certain characters have certain traits. It does require some teamwork, and losing a certain character could be a bit of a loss, but once you get your group rolling, one or two people dying doesn't really mean anything when it comes to re-upgrading shelters and workshops. The bigger loss is the character's skills, and so it doesn't feel as punishing as it is on single player, and makes me wonder how coherent death is supposed to actually be in the game world. I mentioned earlier how when you die, your body should be reanimated and defeated in order to reclaim your equipment. This could be an interesting mechanic in multiplayer because not only do you lose a person, they're then turned against you. Maybe defeating them could partially restore skills or generate a large amount of combat experience, as they are most missed upon death. It would make sense in this instance if you respawn as another survivor in single player, but I don't know if you could say the same for multiplayer. I think a lot of the issues I've raised with the Wild 8 could be resolved with some difficulty rebalancing. I would like to see a hardcore mode implemented to curve out the easy to difficult more smoothly. This could involve permanent death, harsher environments, food that spoils, more intelligent AI, and some kind of new look at the skills and equipment. Death might come across as punishing in normal mode, but with enough time to prepare or allies on your side, the only thing you really lose is your combat and mobility skills, as well as your shelter and workshop upgrades. I think balance will always be the biggest struggle for this game, and I'm no game developer, but I understand that a lot of the decision making on the team is very stressful and difficult. You have to decide what to implement, work on tight schedules, and even have to leave bugs in to patch out later because you just don't have the time or the resources to do what you want to do. This video is very long and took a lot of time, but I don't really expect anything to come of it. A lot of the changes I've suggested would require a huge undertaking to fix that I just can't expect them to actually make the game how I want, especially when it's in early access, and what they should really be doing is focusing on releasing new content and finishing off the story. The Beyond the Door update is the first big content update that the game has had in just a few months after its release. I haven't played much of it though, because to me, getting to it seems too annoying. You have to find 5 decoder keys in random bunkers in order to travel to the new location in the game, a research laboratory away from the snow and the cold. It seems like there's some kind of travel system included that takes advantage of all the power systems the bunkers have, which seems like a really nice addition. There are a few other things, like a new enemy type that may only be encountered at this location, I haven't seen one yet anyway, and a rebalancing of the skill tree. It's nice to see new content, especially when it's not paid DLC, which quite frankly would be taking the piss for a game that's in early access that you've already paid for. But I don't like how inaccessible the new content is. Finding the decoder keys is such a pain in the ass that I just decided not to bother. I wouldn't mind it if it was playing in multiplayer, because your quests are shared, you can find the keys together and it wouldn't be such a slog. But some people will be like me and just not even want to bother. It would just seem like a really long and passive side quest, thinking they won't really get much of a reward anyway. This video has, quite frankly, already gone on long enough. Despite all the criticism I have fairly or unfairly levelled towards The Wild 8, I do really enjoy it. It's not a game that I'll pour hundreds of hours into, but what I do play I'll get high quality enjoyment from it. The reason I made this video was to express myself creatively, and it's something different for me. It's given me a learning experience in terms of editing and scriptwriting, and while I'm not that good at either, I've had fun, for the most part, getting involved in a game that I want to see do well. To me, it feels like this game has a huge amount of potential to really shine and stand out in its genre. Survival is still an ever-growing genre that just has a hell of a lot more bad than good in it, and finding games like this of this high caliber is really difficult still. A game by just 8 people is really quite a huge feat. Small indie game teams usually have more freedom to do what they like, but it comes with the pitfalls of more workload and longer dev times. I think 8 Points should really be proud of what they've accomplished so far, but not let that get in the way of them delivering the rest of the product. It would be really nice if any of my suggestions get heard and at least considered. It would make doing this worthwhile overall, but I'm not really expecting anything. I wanted to be as fair as possible to both the game and its creators, and I've tried to provide as little misinformation as possible. I can't really rate the game because I don't like the idea of ratings and because it's still in early access. Until it's a final product, I couldn't really leave a definitive score anyway, right? But would I recommend it? Maybe. I think as it stands, it's not really worth the price that they're asking. When you have the promise of more content without actually having it, it only seems worth it if you have a serious interest in the game. However, once more of the story has been realised and released, I would recommend this quite happily to anyone interested in a survival game, which if you found this video then you probably are. I don't know how tricky early access is to manage for developers because of the surge in sales that you get with major updates and seasonal discounts. I've seen enjoyable games that got dropped with no intention of being finished that could have been amazing, and while it seems unlikely, I wouldn't want this to happen here with this game. I'm glad I bought this game. Personally, I don't regret paying full price and feel like I got my money's worth, so long as the future content doesn't take a step back in quality. If you made it this far, you're a masochist. You were actually able to listen to me talk for this long, but thank you. If I could do anything differently, it would probably be getting this completed sooner so it has more relevance and so that I could have actually used my motivation when it was in its prime. I hate people who ask, as I don't really think you should, but if you enjoyed this in-depth look at The Wild 8, then consider leaving a like or subscribe if you want to see more like this in the future. 3 small patches were that might seem quite strange, or it's blah 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 blah. I can't talk, but I'll talk about that later on in its own section. The current highest upgrade material in the game. I stepped into this with the expectation of just a simple survival game and was confused as to what I was... Why can I not talk? I stepped into this without... As you look at the map to get your bearings, you might notice the exclamation point marking places of... This is very confusing. But I can't understand standing a few feet away. I've mentioned the skills a few times, so I should probably go over who you are as a character that you've chosen, and you're the chosen one. I am an idiot. Chang gains you skill points. Blah, blah, blah. Personally, I don't regret. Oh my fucking god.